Alright guys, we've had a few requests recently to do a video on ACT reading and the strategies involved in that, as well as the timing and just some tips and tricks for this section, similar to our tips and tricks videos for the other sections. So the reading section is interesting because the content itself doesn't seem to be super difficult. Instead, most students struggle with finishing this section because the timing is pretty tight. So let's talk a little bit about that first. The first tip here is to know the timing. And we have 35 minutes. There are 4 passages, 10 questions in each passage. So what that means is you get about 8 minutes and 45 seconds on average per passage. When you account for the fact that you're going to need to also grid in your answers, I tend to say let's focus on getting it done in 8 minutes per passage. It's also important to note that depending on your target score, you may not even need to get through all of the passages. You may just want to focus on doing 3 out of the 4 and then guessing on the remainder. Let's say you're trying to get like a 25, 26, 27 type of score. It's more important to make sure that you answer the ones correctly that you can rather than try to force yourself to get through all of the questions. And now, obviously, if you're trying to get into the 30s, you're probably going to need all 4 of the passages, and you're going to do reasonably well on that. So that really is completely student dependent. You'll want to find what you're targeting. You'll want to find what your strongest points and your weakest points are, and then develop your own timing strategy for that. So I'm just giving you general guidelines here. Now, in order to maximize the use of our time, we should have a little bit of foreknowledge about what each passage is going to be about. So, the good news on the ACT is that each passage type typically has common question types that are going to be associated with it, and the beauty of it is that the passages are always in the same order. The first passage is always going to be literary narrative or prose fiction. Effectively, we're going to treat those two exactly the same. The only difference is that a literary narrative might also include like a memoir, which is not entirely fiction. So, we consider this to be, generally speaking, one of the easier passages, because we're fairly familiar with reading fiction stories and knowing what to get out of that. So normally when we read fiction, we read it for the plot. However, here we're only going to have 1 page. It's going to be like an excerpt out of a novel or an excerpt out of a short story. So what we want to do is make sure we focus on one major event, or discovery or revelation. And we suggest underlining the key points in the passage. So these guidelines that I'm giving you here are going to basically be, what do you want to underline as you read it? The idea is to make it easier for yourself to go back through the passage and identify what will help you answer the questions. So make sure that you're aware of where one major event or revelation in that prose fiction or literary narrative piece is going to occur. That's what a lot of the questions are going to be about. Secondly, we want to be aware of the characters. Much like when we're reading a novel or watching a TV series or something like that, the characters tend to tell the story. So you want to be aware anytime that we have an introduction of a character, an interaction between 2 characters, or a revelation about a character where we learn something about one of the characters. And that interaction doesn't necessarily have to be conversation. It may be just the 2 characters meeting. It may just be how they are related, whether it's family or friends or, just neighbors or whatever it might be. So because the stuff that the questions are going to be about, is relatively well defined for that first passage, we consider this to be one of the easier passages. So you really don't want to spend an awful lot of time on these, and most of the questions are going to be kind of direct and to the point. The next passage is going to be social science, which is usually going to be some sort of an argument or an opinion. Not always, but a lot of the time. So you want to identify the purpose of the passage. Ask yourself, why did the author write this? Is it to convince us of something? Is it just to inform us about something? What is it? And in either case, then, what we want to do is identify the evidence. The evidence of the author's opinion, the evidence that supports the author's opinion, or maybe some other evidence, like evidence of a particular statement that the author might make, evidence of a story that the author is telling, whatever it may be. And to find that evidence, we usually want to keep track of names, dates, and places. So anytime you see names, dates, and places, you'll want to underline those. If a question then asks you about that name, it's going to be much easier to find going back if you have it already underlined than trying to scan an entire passage for it. The third passage is the humanities passage, and most of the time this is going to be the double passage, but not always. We'll deal with double passages separately in a little bit, but generally speaking, these two are pretty interchangeable. They're really similar. Humanities is usually going to have to do with arts of some sort, but again, it's going to be an argument or an opinion a lot of the time. And that especially goes for double passages, where we're going to get usually two contrasting arguments or two contrasting opinions. Again, these are general guidelines. That's not always true, but it is frequent enough that it's worth noting. And here, once again, we're going to look for the purpose and then supporting evidence of what the author is trying to tell us, and then identify and underline names, dates, places, and just generally interesting facts. And that goes for both of these. Finally, we've got the natural science, and the natural science is going to read kind of like a textbook, so it's just going to be pretty fact-based. So what we want to do for this is usually just identify, again, names, dates, and places, because those will usually be tied to some sort of facts. But very, very importantly, we really want to find the terminology. So because it's natural science and it's usually going to be something you're not terribly familiar with, you want to make sure that any terminology that you don't know, you underline. And a lot of the time that terminology will be explained in the passage, whether directly or just through context clues. So if we can underline these key points and spend about 20% of our passage, have about 20% of our passage underlined, then we'll obviously be in pretty good shape in terms of making it easier for ourselves to locate those things when you go back to the passage. The third tip here actually has to do with a really specific type of question, which is the most nearly means question. It's a vocabulary in context question, and there's a really simple strategy for these. Rather than trying to think of what the definition of a particular word is, because sometimes more than one answer will be the definition, well, all we want to do is just substitute the words in. And I'm actually going to walk through an example here. So I pulled this off of ACT 72C, which is available on the ACT website. It's one of the practice tests, I believe, from 2016-17. I think it's been republished again as the 2017-18 practice exam. And the question is, as it is used in line 38, the phrase drew up most nearly means what? So I'm going to go to line 38 here and identify where that drew up is. Now, you can see that in different contexts, I could probably make the word drew up mean extended or prepared or approached or straightened. So let's see how it's used here. So let's consider this whole sentence. It was on account of their romance with the city that they drew up that weekly rota of shared parental responsibilities. So let's try the word extended. It was on account of their romance with the city that they extended that weekly list of shared parental responsibilities. Okay, that may work. Let's try B. It was on account of their romance with the city that they prepared that weekly list of shared parental responsibilities. That seems really good. It was on account of their romance with the city that they approached that weekly list of shared parental responsibilities. I'm not sure how we would go about approaching that. And it was on account of their romance with the city that they straightened that weekly list of shared parental responsibilities. Well, that's definitely not it. So to decide between A and B, now we should look at the next sentence. And I did cut it a little bit short here, but it would say, when my mother wasn't with me, when I was riding on my father's shoulders, etc., etc. So it sounds like these were the shared parental responsibilities, so most likely they prepared that list, which seemed like the better answer in the first place. So anytime you see a most nearly means question, just make sure you fill your answers in, and usually one of them will work clearly better than the others. The next tip is on dealing with the double passages. And as I've mentioned already, the double passages tend to be the humanities passages, though not always. And they'll tend to be argument-based passages where we have two different opinions, but again, not always. This particular one actually isn't, but my tip here is really, really general. First things first, we should definitely read this little snippet before, and it will tell us a lot about where these passages are coming from and how they are related. So here we have passage A is adapted from the essay Just This Side of Byzantium by Ray Bradbury, which is the introduction to a later edition of Bradbury's 1957 novel Dandelion Wine. Passage B is actually adapted from Dandelion Wine. So this is the intro, and this is an excerpt from the novel. And it's the intro to this novel. Now again, that's not going to be the case most of the time, and that's all right. But that's why we should always read this little piece, particularly before the double passage. But the most important tip here is to actually read and do these passages essentially separately. So if we look at the questions, we have questions about passage A, and we have 5 questions about that. So what we're going to do is we're just going to read passage A and then answer the questions that are about passage A. And then we're going to read passage B and answer the questions about passage B. And then finally, we're going to answer our compare and contrasts after that. The reason that we do this is twofold. First of all, when we read passage A and then B and then start answering questions about A, we might fall victim to what is called recency bias, where we'll actually answer questions about passage A as they pertain to B, because we read that most recently. So we want to make sure we prevent that. So by reading passage A and then answering the questions that are only about passage A, we make sure that we don't fall into the trap answers that have passage B information in them, that have nothing to do with passage A but appear to. Secondly, if we read them separately and then answer these questions after each individual passage, then we get a better understanding of both individually passage A and passage B, which makes it a lot easier to answer these questions. And the final tip here is for number 5, don't be afraid to skip questions that are taking too long. Answer the easier ones first. This seems like an obvious tip, but in terms of a section where the timing is really, really difficult, it's really important. If you spend a minute and a half on a question, you still don't have the answer to it, first of all, to put it bluntly, it's very likely that you're going to get that question wrong anyway. Generally speaking, if you have a question that you're going to be able to answer and get right, you'll probably answer it correctly in the first 30 seconds. If you're spending a lot of time on the question, you're not only sacrificing the future questions, the ability to answer future questions, but you're also not likely to gain anything by actually following up on that question. So if you find yourself reading a question and going, well, what the heck is all of this? I don't understand it at all. And you read it twice and you still don't get it, just skip it. Come back to it later if you have time at the end. That's really important. If you think about the timing, if we have 8 minutes per passage, and conservatively it takes us 3 minutes to read and underline, that leaves you with 5 minutes for 10 questions. That means that we should, in effect, be answering each question in about 30 seconds. So if you go ahead and spend a minute and a half on a question that you're probably at that stage not going to get right anyway, you've now sacrificed 2 additional questions at an average of 30 seconds per question. And that's not good. And I'm going to add one little bit of a tip here that I didn't really think about when I was typing this up, and that is to pick simpler answers. And I'm going to use a little bit of an example here that's not really related to the ACT to prove my point. If I make 2 statements, the first statement is, it is cold outside. And the second statement is, it is 40 degrees outside. In which case am I more likely to be correct? Well, if I say it's cold outside, I'm definitely more likely to be correct, because what if I say it's 40, but it's actually 39? It's still cold, right? So this is a more general answer, and that's going to usually be better. This is a very specific answer, and we should only pick these if we have specific proof. So an important axiom here is specific answers require specific proof. So that goes along with the whole concept of just picking simpler answers. It'll work a lot of the time. If you're stuck between two answers and one of them is really, really detailed and has like 4 parts to the answer and the other is just really general, the general answer is going to be right most of the time. If you have to really look for something and you can't find proof of it because it's super, super specific, it's probably not the correct answer. So keep it simple. Keep your answers short. Don't spend too much time on any question. Don't be afraid to skip it. And make sure we follow these other tips here with these 2 specific question types, the most nearly means and the double passages. If you do all of that, you should be able to increase your speed and increase your efficiency at answering the questions. Once you're able to get through most of them, your score should go up and you should get where you're trying to get. Thank you for watching, and we hope you found this video helpful.